Florida has a town founded by mediums who talk to the dead. It's still there. They still do it. It has a town a pizza billionaire built around a church, and a spring where performers in bathing suits ran out to a 2-lane highway to wave cars into the parking lot. It has towns where the roads run out at the water because the water was the job. It has a grid of streets laid out for a city that never showed up, still running for miles into the scrub. Every list of strange Florida towns treats these as one-offs. Look at this weird place. Look at that one. They aren't one-offs. There are only 5 reasons a town like this happens in Florida, and every one of these places is running on one of them. People treat Florida's strangeness like it comes from nowhere in particular, and that isn't quite right. Every one of these towns exists because somebody made a decision on paper long before anyone actually showed up to live there. A preacher chose a plot of scrub, and Cassadaga is still standing on it 150 years later. A company chose a mill and a payroll. A land agent chose a grid of lines on a map and sold it to people who never saw the ground. What's left behind is a signature, and it's still readable today. It shows up in the width of the streets, in who owns the land under a resident's feet, and in who signs off on the water bill. By the end of this list, one of these 5 reasons is going to explain more of Florida than the other 4 put together. It probably isn't the one anyone would guess walking in. Start with the version where the decision is easiest to see, because the people who made it never stopped being in charge. A town built by belief has one founding entity that's also the developer, the landlord, and often the zoning board, all rolled into one. The physical signature is small and walkable, frozen at whatever architectural moment the belief took root. Land use inside it is governed by a religious corporation instead of an ordinary city hall. Cassadaga, in Volusia County, started with a man named George Colby, a traveling spiritualist medium who said he was guided to the site by a spirit guide he called Seneca. Colby homesteaded the land in 1875. 19 years later, a group of spiritualists who wintered at a camp in Lilydale, New York, wanted someplace warmer. In December of 1894, they formed the Southern Cassadaga Spiritualist Camp Meeting Association. Colby deeded them 35 acres the following January. That association still runs the place. It's a federal tax-exempt church governed by a board of trustees. It regulates land inside the camp the way a homeowners association would regulate a subdivision, except the covenant is religious instead of aesthetic. The camp's buildings still cluster around a central auditorium called the Colby Memorial Temple, alongside the Cassadaga Hotel, a community library, a healing center, and a bookstore. All of it was built to a 19th century village scale that never got wider streets or bigger lots. The camp became a federally recognized historic district in 1991, which locked that scale in for good. Today, it holds about 55 homes on 57 acres, with roughly 100 year-round residents. A good number of them are certified mediums who see clients out of their own living rooms. Volusia County still handles the roads and the police. Everything else, the camp handles itself. Ave Maria, out in Collier County, is the same mechanism running more than a century later, with a different belief and a lot more money behind it. In the early 2000s, Tom Monahan, the man who built Domino's Pizza, wanted land for a Catholic university. Barron Collier Companies, which already owned enormous stretches of Southwest Florida, donated the land for the campus outright and built an entire town around it. The finished master plan runs 5,032 acres, anchored by the university on one end and a towering church called an oratory on the other. It opened in June of 2007. The town center is called La Piazza, a European-style plaza with the oratory towering over it. Retail space surrounds it, along with a parochial school running kindergarten through 12th grade, separate public elementary and middle schools, and amenities that include a water park, a golf course, and a tennis complex. Fire, sheriff, and emergency medical service all cover the town too, just routed through county contracts instead of a town government that doesn't exist. Ave Maria isn't an incorporated city. Legally, it's a planned unit development inside Collier County, so residents pay the same county property tax as anyone else in the region. On top of that, every homeowner also pays into the Ave Maria Stewardship Community District, the Master Association, and a separate neighborhood association. That's 3 layers of governance stacked on a town that has no mayor of its own. A covenant is a durable thing to build a town on. It doesn't wear out, and the people enforcing it are right there. The next kind of town is built on something nobody in town controls at all. Every road town starts with the same bet that enough strangers will drive past to make a living off of. The signature is a business built entirely around whichever highway happened to be carrying the traffic. And the catch is built into the bet, because a place that exists to catch passing drivers has no reason to grow past what the road hands it. Weeki Wachee sits on U.S. Highway 19. In the 1940s, that was a minor 2-lane road running through country with more alligators than gas stations, dirt tracks instead of side streets, and no grocery store for miles in any direction. A former Navy man named Newton Perry had spent the war training frogmen to swim underwater for combat missions. He scouted the spring in 1946 and found it choked with rusted refrigerators and abandoned cars. He cleared it out, then solved a real engineering problem instead of a showman's trick: how to keep a performer breathing underwater without a visible tank. His fix was a free-flow air hose running down from a compressor on the surface, hidden inside the scenery. It let a swimmer breathe, smile, and even eat a banana without ever coming up for air. He built an 18-seat theater carved straight into the limestone, submerged 6 feet below the spring's surface. An audience could watch through glass right into the spring itself. The first mermaid show ran on October 13th, 1947. In those early years, so few cars passed that performers would listen for an engine. They'd run out to the roadside in their bathing suits and wave drivers into the parking lot themselves. By the 1950s, Weeki Wachee had become one of the most popular tourist stops in the entire country. It was built on nothing but a breathing hose and a highway with enough empty stretches that every single car mattered. In 1966, the attraction incorporated itself as an actual city, not because anybody out there needed a government, but because a city gets printed on the state map and posted on the highway signs. The town was created to advertise the spring. That's the best version of this bet anybody in Florida ever ran. Yeehaw Junction, out where U.S. Highway 441 crosses State Road 60 in Osceola County, is what the same bet looks like when nothing extraordinary happens. There was a trading post on that crossroads by 1889, back when the traffic was cattle drivers and wagons. It became the Desert Inn, a bar, restaurant, and motel that served whoever happened to be crossing the middle of the state. The building was listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1994. That building was the whole town. 130 years of traffic came through that crossing, and none of it ever turned into a second block. In December of 2019, a tractor trailer hit the place. The damage was bad enough that it couldn't be restored, and what was left came down in 2024. The endpoint of that logic is a few hours south, on the Tamiami Trail. In Ochopee, the United States Postal Service runs the smallest post office in the country, out of a shed that used to store irrigation pipe for a tomato farm. It's about 7 feet wide. One clerk fits inside at a time. It became a post office in 1953, after a fire took out the general store that had been doing the job. 40 post office boxes, 300 patrons, and a carrier who runs 170 miles of route 6 days a week. That's the entire remaining footprint of a town that once had a store, and it's still open, still on the highway, still catching whoever drives by. Weeki Wachee is the closest thing this category has to a survivor, and even that took an outsider. The state eventually took the spring over as a park, and the Mermaid show still runs today. The city didn't make it. By 2020, the population inside those city limits was down to about a dozen people, and the Florida legislature voted to dissolve it. The spring is still there. The town that got invented to point at it isn't. If you're the kind of person who notices how deliberately a place like this got built, that's the whole reason Florida Empire exists. Subscribe, because there's a lot more Florida still to explain, and almost none of it's an accident. Every one of those places lived on a decision somebody else made about where to put the road, whether the spring was worth buying, whether the town was even worth keeping on the map. The next kind of town is built on something nobody decided at all, which makes it look like the exception to everything on this list. It isn't. From the air, a water town is the easiest one on this list to spot because the street grid just stops. There's no ring road circling back, no subdivision creeping past the last block. Once the town has built out to the edge of the water, there's nowhere left to put a house. Nobody chose that edge, but somebody did choose what the town would make its living on inside it, whether that was a catch, a cargo, or a load of cut timber going out off the same docks. And that decision is the one that determines whether the town is still working a century later. Chokoloskee, out in the 10,000 islands in Collier County, couldn't be reached by anything but boat until a causeway finally connected it to Everglades City in 1955. For decades before that, it was the trade hub for homesteaders scattered across the islands, with its own postmaster by 1892. In 1906, a trader named Ted Smallwood built a store on the edge of Chokoloskee Bay. Because everything already came and went by water, that store became the actual center of the region, the place fishermen, farmers, hunters, and Seminole families all came through for mail, supplies, and gossip. That store was listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1974 and reopened as a museum in 1990. It's still the closest thing the island has to a landmark. Chokoloskee itself is still a working town of commercial fishermen and fishing guides, not a preserved version of one. Cedar Key, up on Florida's Gulf Coast in Levy County, shows what happens when the water job changes but the town doesn't. A railroad reached it in the mid-1800s, shipping out fish, oysters, and sponges. Pencil mills opened there in 1865, riding a timber boom that peaked in the 1880s before the cedar ran out. The oyster beds that came next were fished out by the early 1900s. Then, in 1994, Florida voters banned commercial gill net fishing statewide, and Cedar Key had to reinvent its economy a third time. It went into clam farming. Today, that industry supports more than 500 jobs in a town that produces more than 9 out of every 10 clams farmed in Florida. That's more than 100 million clams pulled out of the same water every single year. Apalachicola, further west along the Panhandle, shows the identical resource dependency at a much bigger scale, and it's the one still playing out in real time. In the 1800s, it grew into the third largest port on the entire Gulf of Mexico, behind only New Orleans and Mobile. At its peak, its bay produced more than 9 out of every 10 oysters harvested in Florida. Apalachicola oysters were a name brand fishery, spoken of the same way people talk about Maine lobster or Maryland blue crab. A fishery collapse in 2013 wiped out an annual harvest worth millions of dollars and thousands of jobs. Reduced fresh water flowing down from Georgia, years of overharvesting, habitat loss, and repeated hurricanes all pushed the bay past the point it could recover on its own. The state closed it to oyster harvesting completely in 2020. Tens of millions of dollars have gone into restoring it since. And this past January, the bay reopened for the first time in 5 years, for a 2-month season that ran through the end of February. Harvest is capped at 10% of the oysters available, and only on reefs that measure up to a minimum count. That's a step back toward a working bay, not a return to what it was. That's what a water town actually is. It isn't quaint scenery. It's an economy with a hard edge, and what the town chose to live on inside that edge is the whole ball game. Apalachicola is still waiting on its bay to come back. Cedar Key got through the same kind of loss 3 separate times, because each time there was something else living in that same water. Either way, both towns are stuck with whatever is actually out there. The next kind of town runs on something that isn't out there at all, and that can be sold to somebody else entirely. In a company town, one payroll or one licensed identity is the entire reason the place is there. The signature is an economy and a skyline built around a single name. That name doesn't have to stay in the same hands for the town to keep running. Clewiston, up on the north shore of Lake Ochopee, got its start in the 1920s as a waterfront land venture. A sugar mill opened there in January of 1929 under the Southern Sugar Company, then went bankrupt in the Depression. In 1931, an industrialist named Charles Stewart Mott, who was also a vice president at General Motors, bought the wrecked company and renamed it United States Sugar Corporation. He had it turning a profit again by the early 40s, and the town grew up around that expanded mill as a textbook company town. It still markets itself today as America's sweetest town, and the sugar company still stands as one of the largest single employers in the region. Then the ownership moved, and it moved in a direction almost no company town ever goes. In the mid-'80s, the employees became the company's largest shareholders through a stock ownership plan. The town still runs on the mill. The difference is that the people running the mill now own a serious piece of the thing they work for. Celebration, down in Osceola County, runs the identical playbook through an entertainment company instead of an agricultural one. Disney ran a design competition for the town's master plan in 1987, then announced it publicly in 1991. It broke ground in 1994 and let the first residents in by lottery in 1996, all built to a new urbanist master plan from the architecture firms of Robert A. M. Stern and Cooper Robertson, which in practice meant a street grid laid out around walking to the store instead of parking at it. Disney sold off its ownership stake in the mid-2000s. Celebration isn't an incorporated city, and every property in it is privately owned today. That means the design and the covenants outlive the company that wrote them. Latitude Margaritaville, out in Daytona Beach, pushes that same playbook one step further, and there's no actual company town left in it at all. It's built by a professional developer, Minto Communities, under a brand license from Margaritaville Holdings. There's no Jimmy Buffett employee anywhere on site, just a licensed name applied to a standard age-restricted community. Minto bought 1,600 acres from the Consolidated Tomoka Land Company and broke ground in March of 2017. More than 300 buyers camped out overnight ahead of the November 2017 sales launch. The finished community, 3,763 homes, sold out more than 5 years ahead of Minto's own projections. Minto and Margaritaville Holdings liked the model enough to license it out twice more, since once in Hilton Head, South Carolina, and once further up Florida's own coastline in Watersound. 4 types down, and every one of them explains a town or a handful of towns. The last type doesn't operate at that size. It was never drawn for one town at a time. A land scheme town runs backwards from every other type on this list. The grid comes first. The people come later, if they come at all. It starts with cheap raw land, bought before anyone wanted it, platted for a population that doesn't exist yet, then sold sight unseen to buyers who'd never once set foot on it. The signature is a finished street grid, or a network of dug canals, stretching for miles past the point where any houses actually stand. Cape Coral is the most familiar name in this category, and it earns exactly one line. Brothers Leonard and Jack Rosen bought 103 square miles along the Caleoosahatchee River in 1957, marketed it as a waterfront wonderland, and dug more than 400 miles of canals to build the boat access city that's actually there today. Golden Gate Estates is the version that didn't get finished. The same Rosen brothers started assembling it in 1957 too, just southeast of Cape Coral, eventually reaching 175 square miles. They announced it as the largest residential development ever planned in America. They cut roads into the scrub, dug more than 800 miles of flood control canals, and platted the land into more than 20,000 lots of an acre and a quarter each. Land the company had bought for roughly $100 an acre went back out to out-of-state buyers at many times what it paid. Plenty of those buyers flew in on the company's own fleet of private planes for a free steak dinner and a sales pitch. Sales trips were scheduled around the summer rainy season on purpose, because during the wet months, the only way to reach most of those lots was by boat. By the mid-70s, fewer than 1 in 10 of those lots had ever had a house built on it. No utilities, no schools, and no stores had ever been built to match the plat on paper. The company that drew those lines, by then sold off and renamed, filed for bankruptcy in 1975. Lehigh Acres in eastern Lee County ran the same play with a different price point and a different buyer. It was founded by Lee Ratner, who'd made his fortune off decon rat poison. He bought roughly 18,000 acres in 1951 and first named it the Lucky Lee Ranch. In 1954, he partnered with an advertising executive named Gerald Gould, an accountant named Manuel Riskin, and a real estate man named Edward Shapiro. Together, they started selling half-acre lots for $10 down and $10 a month, an installment plan built for ordinary post-war families instead of wealthy investors. By the end of the 60s, more than 5,000 families were living there. The payment plan was cheap enough that owning a piece of Florida stopped being something only the wealthy could do. Congress eventually caught up to exactly this sales model. In 1968, it passed the Interstate Land Sales Full Disclosure Act, patterned after the same securities law that regulates the stock market. The law requires any developer selling 100 or more lots across state lines to register the subdivision, hand every buyer a formal property report before they sign anything, and give them at least a week to cancel before the deal becomes final. It's still the law today, now administered by the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and it exists because of towns exactly like these two. Before that law, the only protection a buyer had was whatever the salesman on the airplane happened to tell them. Here's the promise from the top of this list, the one about a single reason explaining more of Florida than the other 4 put together. This is it. Cape Coral has about 245,000 people in it today. Lehigh Acres has roughly 150,000. Add up every belief town, road town, water town, and company town named in this entire video, and the whole pile together doesn't come to 50,000. Not a preacher's camp, not a sugar mill. A grid of lines drawn on a map by a salesman for buyers who hadn't seen the ground is where most people in this state actually ended up living. Think about Cassadaga's 35 deeded acres, Apalachicola's Oyster Bay, and Clewiston's Company Mill. Every one of them is a smaller scale version of the same basic move, just executed by a preacher, a fishing fleet, or a sugar company instead of a land agent with an airplane full of buyers. Somebody drew the lines before a single resident showed up to live inside them. In this last category, that somebody drew a lot more lines than anywhere else on this list. Line up all 5, and the differences stop looking like differences in kind. A religious corporation controls a belief town. A road town is controlled by traffic it doesn't own, which is why it never gets any bigger than what the highway hands it. A water town looks like the exception, because nobody chose the coastline, but somebody chose the catch, and that choice is what the place lives or dies on. An employer, or these days whoever's paying for the brand license, runs a company town. Whoever platted the grid before anyone else arrived still answers for a land scheme town. Every one of them is the same move, dressed differently. Somebody decided the shape of the place before the people who'd actually live there ever got a vote, and the town kept running on that decision long after the person who made it was gone. It's a classification that works from the air as well as it works on the ground. A dead-end grid running into open water is a water town. One landowner, one board, or one company still calling every shot decades later is either belief or a company town. A cluster of buildings on an old 2-lane highway that never became a second block is a road town. And a grid or a canal network that keeps running for miles past the point where the houses stop is a land scheme, which is the one that will identify more of this state than the other 4 combined. Cassadaga's mediums are still working out of their own living rooms. Ochopee's post office is still open, 7 feet wide, on a highway most people cross without stopping. Apalachicola's bay opened this past winter for 2 months, the first harvest allowed there in 5 years. Golden Gate Estates still has streets running past lots that have sat empty for the better part of 70 years, waiting on a plat that outlived the company that drew it. None of that is random. It's 5 decisions made by 5 different kinds of authority, and the next Florida town that looks strange from the road is standing on one of them. There's a lot more of this state built exactly this deliberately, one decision at a time. Subscribe, and we'll keep finding the next decision before it's obvious.